Hello everyone, today we're going to go over how to use the Foliage Tool and how to optimize foliage in your scene. As you can see, I have this scene created and I'm only getting around 20 FPS at most. First thing we're going to do is go over the basics of the Foliage Tool, and then we'll try to optimize the scene and go over some static mesh options that you can take into account when building your level. For this tutorial, I'm using a chestnut pack that I found in Fab. It's free for a personal use, so you might want to use this one for the tutorial or just practice or even in your final project. Open your content folder and find where all your static meshes are for the foliage, and then you open the Foliage Tool, select your meshes, and you simply click and drag. I've already done it, so I'm not going to repeat it. Once you add it to your foliage, you can start experimenting with the different types of brushes. The main ones you're going to be using is the paint and the erase, but the select one you might also find useful. The select allows you to select a single instance from the ones you've painted. So if I wanted to remove only this tree or remove it a bit, you can also do that. The paint is the one we're going to use the most. To paint, we first need to select the meshes that we want to paint. So in this case, I'm going to select the grass. And as you can see, we have a semicircle now around the plane. We can change the brush size also, and we can change the paint density. So if I were to paint 2 circles here and get a bit closer, you can see we have them both. You can't see them at a distance, and that's because of the LOD level, something we'll cover later on. And now we also have the single, but for this we only have to select one mesh. And then if we want to be more specific about the placement, we can simply do so like this. So maybe you want to place some grass around the cracks in a road or something like this, you would use something like this. And the next thing we're going to use the most is the erase tool. If you simply have make sure you have the meshes that you want to delete selected, otherwise it won't delete anything. And then we go over it. It will delete everything. Another thing is that we might not want to delete everything, so we might only want to delete something, and this is where the erase density numbers can come in handy. If I increase this a bit, you can see I've deleted only some of them. You can play with this number around a bit until you get whatever you want. That's just in case you've already painted the scene and you think it's too dense, and with this tool maybe you want to thin the foliage a bit. The next options we're going to go over are the ones that you can find in any static mesh. So if I were to select this one and scroll down, we can see what the static mesh selected is, and we can also see the painting and placement options. These options we'll cover later on when we're trying to optimize the scene. So inside painting you have 3 options which you're going to use the most probably, which is the density, the radius, and the scale. We don't need the advanced. Okay, so the density is how many of those meshes you can place within the circumference of the brush. If I were to put something really tiny, you see that we don't place many. If I were to increase this number, you can see how this changes. We can also determine the radius, so how much distance is there between each instance. So if we were to increase this by a lot and try to paint, we wouldn't paint anything because this distance is way too much. Let's put 500 and now paint. And as you can see, the distance between each mesh is at least 500 units. I actually have an example here that I wanted to show you. So this is a tree that has a density of 50, but it has a radius of 0. And as you can see, the trees are just putting themselves on top of each other. If we increase the distance between them, you get something like this. The problem is that the radius only takes into account its own static mesh. It won't take into account other trees. So here, even though all the trees have a radius of 500, the distance between different types of trees is not taken into account. So you have to be careful when you use those options. You'll have to play with the density and the radius to get something that you want. The next option you want to take into account is the scale. So let's just do this really saturated. To keep some variety, even though it might be the same mesh, you might want to have a bit of variance within the scale, and this is what you use it for. Then we can go into the placement options. The set offset means how high the static mesh is placed with respect to the landscape. So for example, this tree, if I were to select it, you can see that the pivot point is actually not at the base of the tree, it's a bit higher up. So with this tree, we have a bit of room to change the set offset. So we can place it higher or lower than the landscape. Then we have the align to normal. This basically means that the foliage is going to be placed perpendicular to the angle of the surface. So if we go back to our landscape, you can see that all my trees, if I click on any trees, I have this disabled because I want all my trees to be completely straight. But my grass has this, so it's aligned to normal. And as you can see, my grass is always perpendicular to the slope of the terrain. Then you want to take into account the random yaw should always be ticked, since it will rotate the mesh in different ways, so there's also a bit of variety there. Random pitch, you have to be a bit more careful because it's really easy to have the static meshes look a bit weird. So we paint this here. You can see now that some of the grass is tilted in different angles. If we were to increase this and do a big number, you get something like this. Then the ground slope angle is the maxed angle at which grass will be placed. This is a way to exclude certain areas to have foliage. So in my landscape, I didn't want the rock surfaces or the really steep rock surfaces to have any foliage, and this is how you would control it, with the ground slope angle. And then, yes, another way you can actually control where you place foliage is with these advanced options. So as you can see in my scene, I don't have any foliage placed on the path layer of the landscape. And this is because when I placed the grass, if we reduce the brush size a bit, right now we can place some grass here, as you can see. But if I were to go to my options here and in the exclusion landscape layers add an index, I can type the name of the layer. If you don't know the name of the layer, you can always go to your landscape, paint, and here are the names of your layers. In my case, it's main, blend, and path. So I'm choosing not to paint any foliage on my path layer. If we click on the grass we had selected, you can see that in our exclusion landscape layers we have path. So now if I try to paint, I can't. You can also play around with these numbers to determine how far away from the border between one layer and the other grasses are placed. Okay, now that we have the foliage tool more or less covered, we can go over how to set up your static mesh for the foliage. There's really only two options, but I did want to show the difference between Nanite and Nanite Plus Preserve Area. The first option is Level of Details. This one gives you more control, but in some cases it's less performant than Nanite. The problem with Nanite is that it doesn't really work well with masked materials. And sometimes when the wind effect is too much or too exaggerated, you might get some artifacts, or the shadows might not be correct. So you need to be careful and see what fits your project best. So to see the main differences, we are gonna go backwards and see how distance affects the mesh. As you can see, the Nanite Plus Preserve Area is the one that retains most detail. Nanite without Preserve Area is not really that useful, to be honest. And then the LODs are really not that bad either, if they are well performant. The only problem with Nanite is that you have less control than with LODs. We're going to go over the options each of them have now. So the first thing we're going to cover is the LODs. Something you need to take into account when getting foliage is the amount of triangles and vertices they have. This one is not too bad to be a tree. 30,000 is not that much. If you were to download, for example, a tree from Megascans from Quixel, like this one, you can see that the tree itself has, sorry, this is not even, yeah, at lot 0, the maximum number of triangles is 1,700,000, and that is way too much. I do recommend that when the mesh has so many triangles, you enable Nanite, since in most cases it will be more performant. Anyway, let's go back. So LODs, here you can see the different levels of LOD, so levels of details that this tree has. In this case it has 4. LOD 0 is at maximum level of detail. LOD 3 is probably the billboard, so this is what you will see at a really long distance. And if we put LOD Auto, we can see, if you look at the top left corner, you can see the LOD at which we are and the number of triangles each LOD has. So at 0 we have 30,000, at LOD 1 we have 18,000, and LOD 2 we have 10,000, and at LOD 3 we only have 8. The way we edit the LODs is down here. Here's where we pick the LOD that we want to edit. So let's say that we want LOD 1 to come in sooner. We can actually adjust the screen size, and instead of being it at 0.4, we want it sooner, so at 0.5. We can simply change that here. If we want the engine to calculate these for us, we can simply go down here to LOD settings and auto-compute LOD distances. We can also increase the number of LODs that the engine can calculate, and we can even group them into foliage, high detail, large prop, or whatever we want. Inside each LOD we can also adjust the percentage of triangles. So at LOD 0, the number of triangles is 100. At LOD 1 we're getting 60%, and at LOD 2 we are getting 35%. You can also adjust these as you want. The ideal case is that the player can't even notice the change in LODs. So you have to play around with the screen size and the triangle percentage to achieve this effect, while also conserving some performance. The next thing we're going to go over is the Nanite. In most cases you want to have this ticked on, which is the preserve area, which will allow the mesh to retain the space that it actually takes up on your screen. If you want to increase or decrease the quality, you'll have to play around with these options. The problem with Nanite is that you cannot adjust these levels of details with as much control as with LODs. Here you can edit them one by one. But in general, Nanite is more performant. Something I realized, if you look at this plant, for example, if I go further back, Nanite already determines that these branches shouldn't be there at this distance. This is where LODs are more useful because you can control the level of detail manually. With Nanite you have to basically leave it all to the engine, which is why in some case I think the best result is when you combine Nanite and LOD. So let's say that trees, since they have a lot more triangles, you put as Nanite, and then grass you leave as LODs. Something like this might work out for you, but it will all depend on the type of foliage you're using. Okay, now that we've covered this more or less, we're going to try out different things on the actual landscape and see if we can increase the FPS we're getting out from it. Okay, to start optimizing our foliage, we have to go back into our Foliage Tool, and we're going to start with the trees. Actually, the first thing we're going to do is check whether the foliage performs better with Nanite or with LODs. Right now everything is LODs, so actually can go back to the selection mode. So right now we're getting around 20, less than 20 FPS. Let's go to our content and the chestnut pack. We are going to filter by static mesh. If you don't know how to filter, you can simply click here and select the type of things that you want to filter by, and then simply click here and we can see all the static meshes that we have here. I'm gonna select them all, right click, and I want to enable Nanite on all of them. Now we simply have to wait a bit. Okay, that's done, and we're getting more or less the same results. Maybe a tiny bit more stable, but not really much difference. Okay, so what we want to do now is go into the Foliage Tool. We're going to start with the trees, and we're going to edit those options first. So the first thing we want to determine, as you can see, preserve area is not applied on those trees, so we might actually want to do that to see the results better. Let's go. We have them already selected. Right click, Asset Actions, Edit and Selection Property Matrix, and then under the Nanite settings we want to click Preserve Area on all of them. Now we save them and close. Okay, much better. Now the trees, we want them to be visible from far distance, so we're gonna leave the cull distance at 0, which means that they will never disappear. Cull distance basically means that at a certain distance, the one you determine, the instances will no longer be rendered. Then we want the shadow also to be nice and clear, and we also want it to move with the world space. So we're going to leave those options by default. What we are going to change is the world position offset. We don't really care if these trees are moving. We can't really appreciate if the trees are moving from this distance, so we might as well disable the world position offset at a certain distance. So let's say a distance of 8,000. As you can see, we already gained a bit of FPS. We're not going below 20 now. Now we're going to go onto the next level, so the small trees. With these small trees, I do have a cool distance, since the player is not really gonna see them that far away. If I were to disable this, you can see them that they just reappeared. But we can play with these numbers until we get something that we're happy with. And also the distance for the world position offset is set at 4000. We might want to reduce that even a bit more. And the shadow cache invalidation, sorry, I should have covered this before. This is really expensive in general because it's recalculating the shadow every time the mesh moves with the wind. So if we actually say static, kind of reduce the resources it takes to calculate that. Okay, so small trees are done. Let's do all the small plants. So, realistically, we're not gonna see those plants if we're really further away, so we might as well put this at 6000 and this at 5000. So the distance between these 5000 and 6000 is where the meshes will start to disappear. We also want these shadows to be statics, since they don't want to have to be calculated all the time. And the world position offset, we want it only to be visible when we're really close to the plant, so let's do 2000. Okay. We're leaving the grass for the latest because it's going to probably be the biggest difference, since we have close to 350,000 meshes for each type of grass. I'm going to do the rocks now. We also want them to be visible from a really long distance, but we don't need them to always be visible, so let's do maybe 20,000 to 18,000. We also want the shadow cache to be static, and we are not evaluating the world position of this one because the rocks are not going to move with the wind. So we're getting around 25 FPS right now, which is really bad. Now let's start to edit the grass. So the cool distance for the grass should be around 10,000 to 9,000. We've already gone back to actually 90 FPS just by doing that. And if we move around the landscape, the change is noticeable, but not that much. So when doing these optimizations, you also have to take into account which of these instances is the most common, and here it's the grass by far. So the impact it has on performance is really huge. We're also going to change the shadow cache invalidation behavior to static. Okay, and we're going to change the maximum distance for the world position offset to be 2000. And we're up to 100 FPS right now. We go to the selection and we click play. We getting around 90 to 75 FPS while walking around. So we went from 20 FPS to 80 FPS just by editing some of those things. Right now we have Nanite enabled and everything, but we might also want to start experimenting and using Nanite on only the trees and LODs with the rest of the material. So we're going to do that now. Let me just do this. This command is basically so we don't have that error anymore. So now we've played. We don't have the error on the top left corner. Okay, let's go back to our content drawer. And we're only gonna leave the Nanite enabled on the trees and the rocks. And we've actually lost some performance. It's actually more or less the same, so it doesn't really matter for these types of foliage. And 80 FPS is more than a respectable number. But then again, if you wanted to play with the with the level of details for each mesh and everything, you could still do that. You could also keep playing with the numbers, so realistically you're not gonna really notice foliage moving at this distance, so you even might want to reduce those settings. But basically these are the options that you want to play around with. The cull distance, shadow options, and especially the world position offset is really expensive. Another thing you might want to take into account is when creating the options for your game, you have to have these things selected in order for the player to be able to reduce the foliage density. So let me show you what I mean. If I select everything here and then I want to enable cull distance scaling and enable density scaling. Let's save everything. Go back to the selection, and here where I have scalability, right now I have it on high. If I were to reduce it to medium, you can see that the density of foliage has also been reduced. This is only accomplished if you have those options. This is only accomplished if you have those options selected. Go back to high. We can go back to epic. As you can see, the FPS will also change. If you don't have it up here, you can always go to settings and then engine scalability settings, and here you'll have the option. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and found some use into it, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.